Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video I am going to be going through some of the best things that I've read so far this year, so my best reads from spring. Those of you that have been on this channel for a while will know that I tend to do reviews of books in the fantasy genre, also Gothic fiction, and also classics. So I'm going to be splitting this video up into 3 parts for each of those categories. I'm going to start with fantasy, then do Gothic and horror, and then round up with some classics. It goes without saying that because these are on the best reads of spring list, they're all books that I thought were really great, but I am going to rank them out of 10, although all of them will have a score between 8 and 10 because they're all really good novels, just to give you a bit of insight into how much I really enjoyed or didn't quite enjoy them but still did, if that makes any kind of sense. Okay, so starting with fantasy. First thing on the list we have The Voyage of the Dawn Trader by C.S. Lewis. This is the 5th book, I think, in the Chronicles of Narnia series, and it follows Edmund and Lucy as they return to Narnia, along with their really annoying spoilt brat of a cousin, Eustace, and they go on a voyage with Caspian that sees them go to all kinds of different places, meet lots of different people, and this is why I really enjoyed this book in the series. It's why, for me, I think it's a standout of the series. It's breaking away from the earlier stories which are very much contained in Narnia, taking us beyond. There's way more characters. I also feel like the character work was better well done in this one. I thought that Eustace, beginning as a spoilt brat and then slowly as the novel progresses maturing into a nice person, or more or less nice person, was really great. So yeah, this was a great entry in the series. What would I give it out of 10? Probably a 9, just because I am finding during my reread, and this is something I might talk about maybe in my next review, I am finding Lewis's writing style a little bit irritating. He oftentimes breaks the fourth wall to give these asides to the reader that come across as very condescending. Now this might just be because I'm now an adult reading a children's series, so it could just be that I don't like that style anymore. But even then, I would, you don't have to write in that style when you're writing for children. So it's just something that's griping a little bit on me. So 9 out of 10, still good, but not perfect. Next on the list we have Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch. This is the second novel in Scott Lynch's Gentleman Bastard series, and it follows Locke and John again, getting up to all kinds of mischief, but this time in a very different place, in a very different setting, with completely new characters. Now, when I went into this, I was a bit skeptical that I would like it, because one thing that I find with some writers anyway is, if you begin a series, and then you remove a lot of the characters and players from that first book, and in the second book you move on to a very different style, very different setting, that can be a bad move in terms of, as a reader you might miss the things from the first book, or the new things aren't as good as the things were in the first book. So I was worried I wasn't going to enjoy this. But actually, I think it's better than the first book. I thought the plot was way more interesting, not that the first one wasn't either. I really liked the relationships in this one even more than the first. I found that the side characters were actually better fleshed out for me than they were in the first book. So this really blew my mind. I think this might be, of the fantasy ones, I think it's probably the best fantasy book that I've read so far this year. And I'm really looking forward to carrying on with this with the Republic of Thieves, and I really hope the next book in the series also comes out soon, because I'm really loving this series. So no questions for me then, 10 out of 10, perfect book. Next on the list we have one of the strangest fantasy books anyway that I've read so far, and that is Ice by Anna Kavan. Ice is a tricky one to describe, because if you describe the novel it sounds kind of boring. Basically there's this unnamed character, this male character, following this female character, and thinking some very disturbing thoughts about this female character. Meanwhile, it seems as though there's an ice apocalypse going on. The world is freezing and slowly, catching up to them as he's chasing this girl. But it also could be that ice is just his imagination because he's crazy. And that's what makes this book fascinating, because it could be sci-fi or it could just be a psychological novel about a crazy person. And it's really off the wall and bizarre, and it's a difficult one, but it's worth reading. It's something that is unique, I think, in terms of sci-fi. I've never quite read anything like it, and that's why it's on this list. That being said, I am only going to give it an 8 out of 10, just because sometimes the zaniness and craziness was too off the wall, and it was really hard to actually follow what was going on a lot of the time. So, not perfect by any means, but still fantastic, and if you want to read something interesting, I would definitely give this book a try. It's also very short, so go for it. Next up on the list we have the 5th book in the Wheel of Time series, The Fires of Heaven. So I did review this quite recently on my channel, and I did say in that video that I am enjoying this a lot more than I did from the first time that I read the series. I thought that the climax of this book was probably one of the best climaxes of the series and of a fantasy novel in general. I really like how Jordan is able to weave several separate plots together in a very interesting way and just bring all of these things together. He also has some great character moments in this one. It's hard to really talk about this one too much without spoiling things, so I'm not really going to talk about specifics too much. But Nynaeve's character work in this one was great. Rand's character work was great. The whole book was just really good. A really important book in the series as well in terms of character development and things shifting away from when the adult characters are the ones in charge and pulling the strings to the younger characters taking charge and moving the plot forward. Fantastic book. That being said, I am only going to give it a 9 out of 10 just because I did think that there were certain passages that probably could have been cut. There were bits that just seemed to go on for a bit too long, and that is just a thing with Jordan's writing. He takes his time, and unfortunately that means having a slightly less than perfect score for me. Okay, now we're on to Gothic Fiction. So first on the list we have The Italian, which I have also reviewed recently on the channel. This is a wonderful Gothic novel, and probably one that you may not have heard of because it's not as well known as, say, Dracula or Frankenstein. The Italian follows two lovers. One is the noble-born Vivaldi, and the other is the lower-born Eleanor, and their relationship is torn apart by Vivaldi's cruel and horrible, in a very good way, mother, the Marchesa, and her confessor, an evil monk called Schedoni. Now, what makes this book fantastic are these two villains, the Marchesa and Schedoni. They are horrible people, but they're also very believable people. They're not just evil for evil's sake, they have ambition and drive, and they also have lapses of guilt and moments of vulnerability, which for me just makes them perfect villains. I really enjoyed this book, and if you haven't read any Anne Radcliffe, I would probably say, having not read everything of hers yet, but having read her most well-known book, The Mysteries of Udolpho, I would definitely recommend starting here, because it's much shorter in length. In fact, Udolpho, well, it's way over there, so I'm not going to get it, but Udolpho is much bigger and has long passages of waffle, whereas this is much tighter in its plot. So give this a try if you want to get into some Gothic fiction, because it's a wonderful book. 10 out of 10 for me on this one. Next up is a book I listened to an audiobook, so I don't have a physical copy again, and that is The Tale of the Body Thief by Anne Rice. The Tale of the Body Thief is the 4th book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series, and it follows Lestat as he makes a deal with a human body switcher, and so that Lestat can go in this human body and this switcher can have his vampire body. This concept for me was great because it allowed us to explore what it would be like for someone who's been a vampire for 200 years to go back and be a human and do all the lovely and sometimes disgusting things that humans do, and it was really well executed. And also what I liked about this one was that not only the concept that I thought was great, but the plot and was actually, for once with an Anne Rice book, it was really well paced for me. One of the problems that a lot of people have with Anne Rice's work is that she can sometimes waffle and have very severe pacing problems, but with this one I didn't find that at all. I thought the plot was great, the character work was great, and the concept was great. Definitely a peak in the series, and so I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10, because I do think that some of the earlier books were a little bit better than this one, but I read those last year, not this year, so that's why they're not on this list. Next up we have Faust by Goethe, and this is, well, Faust Part 1 by Goethe. I haven't read Part 2 yet. Faust is a classic Gothic tale in which Faust, who is a scientist, sells his soul to Mephistopheles in order to gain knowledge about reality because he's tired of just finding out things in the usual way. He feels like he's not going anywhere, so he makes this evil deal to gain new knowledge and the tragedies that ensue from his deal or pact with the devil. This was a wonderful book. It's actually, it's a play, but it's told in poem form with, I think, one small exception, which is prose towards the end. And it's so good. I mean, this is a translation, and even the translation is fantastic. So I really enjoyed this. I thought that it read really well. The person who did the translation was able to do it in a way that was very engaging, even to a modern reader. It was also quite funny in places. There's a passage where Mephistopheles is talking to this student and telling him how useful certain degrees are at university, and I found that hilarious. Yeah, it's a really good book. It's funny in places, it's dark in places, and it's just one of those classic tales, you know, selling your soul to the devil, all that. So again, Classic piece of Gothic literature with this one, and 10 out of 10, just flawless. Okay, so now on to the last book in this section of the video, and that is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Wuthering Heights tells us the story of Heathcliff, who is one of the best anti-heroes ever. We follow him from his early days as a child who is taken in by a kind family, or well, at least the father of the family is kind, and his relationship with one of the children of the family, Catherine, and their eventual love, and the fallout of that, which leads to him doing some pretty terrible and cruel things to the other people in her life, and also the future generations to come. This is a great book, and I think it's, in some ways, even though it is a classic, I feel like it doesn't get as much love as it should, because it's quite difficult to read, and the second half of the book is a bit of a chore at times. But it's so good. I really like how evil and horrible these characters are, because you don't often get that in a book. Even in books where you have villainous characters as protagonists, oftentimes what you'll get is even more terrible people in the book, so that you can still sort of root for the protagonist, even if they're not perfect themselves. Whereas this book just follows horrible people through and through. So it's a really nice exploration of that. I think it's a great book, and I am surprised I haven't reviewed it on this channel yet. I might review it at some point, or maybe even do an analysis video on it. So let me know if you'd be interested in me talking about this one in more depth, because I really do like this book, and it goes without saying that it's 10 out of 10 for me. Okay, now on to the best classics that I've read so far this year. First up, we have Ulysses, which is a beast of a book, and probably the most difficult book that I have read so far this year. Even more difficult than Anna Kavan, probably because Anna Kavan was much shorter. Maybe if she was as long as this, it'd be just as much. Well, no, this will probably still be harder, but yeah, this is the hardest thing that I've read this year. But it was really was worth reading. If you want a challenge, then I really would recommend reading this book. But be prepared to spend a lot of time reading it. You cannot read this quickly, and that's not just because it's nearly 700 pages, it's because there are just there are just chapters that are completely off the wall. There's chapters that don't make any sense. There's chapters with hallucinations in them. There's a chapter without any punctuation in, the last chapter. Yeah, it's a hard book to describe. Again, kind of like Anna Kavan's Ice, the plot is pretty simple. It's just a man going about his business in Ireland one day. But because of the techniques that Joyce employs to tell the story, that's what makes it difficult to read and so much of a challenge. So yeah, I really did enjoy this, but it was hard work. But I am going to give it a 10 out of 10 just because the ability to actually write something like this and to have that level of craft and to employ so many different styles of writing throughout is just jaw-dropping, really. It's definitely worth a read if you want a challenge. The next one I have on the list is something that I bought on Kindle, so again, I don't have a physical copy, and that is Iris Murdoch's Under the Net. Under the Net follows Jake Donahue, who is a mooch and a layabout and a drunkard who's in his 30s, early 30s, and we follow his life as he mooches off people, tries to rekindle some old flames and friendships, and tries to better himself, but also doesn't really do that very well. What I liked about this book wasn't so much the plot, which there were times actually when I thought the plot meandered a little bit, especially in the kind of second third of the book. What I liked about the book was the writing style. Murdoch has a really light style that is, even though it's light, it's incredibly sharp. The way she's able to describe London, which is where the book takes place, it really makes you feel like you know the layout very well, even if you've not been there, which is fantastic, especially because, at least for me at least, when I'm writing, location stuff can be some of the hardest stuff to do, especially if you're doing things like streets and various districts in cities. That can be really hard to convey to a reader well. Not only does she do this well, but she does it in such short, passages that it just makes it even better. She also has a lot of wit, and the character of Jake Donahue is hilarious, and the situations that he gets into are almost sometimes slapstick. There's a scene where he's spying on someone, and some people see him through a window, and they think he's basically mentally ill, and they're pointing at him and slowly getting all of the neighbours together to come to him, and then he has to try and signal to them no, stop, it's fine, and that just makes them think he's even more insane, and then eventually he runs away. And there are lots of scenes like this, kind of inappropriate, silly, slapsticky scenes, and she's really good at making them funny. Yeah, I really enjoyed the humour in this and the style of this one. I would give this one though a 9 out of 10 just because, like I said, there are some points in the plot that I did think meandered a bit, but the writing style is just perfect, so it's still a fantastic book, even if there are a few little niggles with the plot itself. And finally on the list we have The Secret History by Donna Tartt. The Secret History follows the character of Richard, who goes to university and falls in with a crowd who are part of an elite group that study under this eccentric professor. They study ancient Greek, and these students are very colourful characters and they're obsessed with Greek culture, and in particular the Bacchanalia, I think that's what they were called. These kind of incredibly decadent events the ancient Greeks would have, where they would get incredibly drunk, raucous, eat, drink, probably murder, do lots of crazy things, and they try and emulate this debauchery, and there are tragic consequences to that, which I won't spoil, although one of the main tragedies is spoiled on the first page, but I will still not spoil it for you. You can find out what happens when you read the book for yourselves. But it's such a good book. The character work in this is just, again, flawless. When I was reading this, I watched some interviews with Donna Tartt, and she said she was inspired a lot by Dickens, and you can see that that is something that's inspired her, because like Dickens, she creates these incredibly colourful and vivid characters that all feel very distinctive from one another. I really enjoyed the character work in this one, and I really enjoyed the writing style. I thought she had a great style that was a bit dense, and there are lots of references and things like that, but again, it doesn't feel overbearing, and it doesn't feel like you get too bogged down in that kind of stuff. So I really enjoyed the writing style and the characters and the story in this one. And for me, again, I think a lot of them have been 10 out of 10s, but that's no surprise on a list like this. Yeah, it's a 10 out of 10 for me for The Secret History. Okay, that's it for this video. Hopefully there were some books in there that have piqued your fancy and you will go forth and read them, and then you can come back and talk to me about them on the channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel to get notifications. I post new videos every Monday at 4 PM. But that's it for me now, so take care everyone, and I'll see you all in the next video.